Anne Hill Carter Lee is much a mystery. She left very little of herself for historians to ponder. Only one portrait, which may or may not be hers, survives, and the woman in it, wearing a miniature of George Washington on her left breast and holding a spray of spring flowers, looks nothing so much as she does mysterious. A dress, which was hers, preserved in Richmond, suggests that she was about 5 feet 6 inches tall and of medium build. A mere handful of letters are extant, but she did leave one revealing legacy of herself, her son Robert. Such is what Emery M. Thomas notes in his Robert E. Lee, describing how the life of the son reflected the character of the mother. Robert E. Lee has long stood as the marble man, a commander whose battlefield exploits were matched only by an austere, almost superhuman standard of personal conduct. He was a soldier of immaculate composure, a gentleman whose life was governed by a severe sense of duty and virtue in the best tradition of the Virginia gentry, a man whose unbending sense of honor and a profound, quiet, Christian resignation to the sovereign will of Providence all stand as a testament to his character. And who was it that helped him cultivate this character? Not Light Horse Harry, other than in the example of what not to do when anywhere else than the battlefield. No, Robert had his father's tactical and strategic genius, but otherwise was near entirely different than him, avoiding the speculation, debt, dishonor, and squandered wealth and talents for which Light Horse Harry was known, as we covered in a recent episode. Instead, every pillar of Robert E. Lee's soul, his rigid self-command, his scrupulous financial precision, his quiet self-denial, his resolute dignity, his deep piety, was forged by his mother in her long, silent martyrdom. Robert E. Lee understood this truth with absolute lifelong clarity. Throughout his career, in moments of victory and in the bitter twilight of defeat, he always admitted the same thing. He owed everything to his mother. Her name was Anne Hill Carter Lee, known affectionately to her kinsman as Nancy. She was a daughter of the pinnacle of the Virginia aristocracy, born to the opulent halls and manicured lawns of Shirley Plantation on the James River, long a fabulous seat of the Carter family. Her life began in the sunlit lap of 18th century privilege, surrounded by all the wealth, culture, and security the great planter dynasty of the Carters could bestow. Yet her destiny was bound to a whirlwind of debt, domestic abandonment, and public humiliation. She was dragged from the grandeur of the James to the freezing, creditor-haunted rooms of a decaying Stratford Hall, where she endured the siege of bailiffs, the trauma of an unwanted pregnancy, and the slow, agonizing destruction of her husband's reputation before the family left for Alexandria, as we covered in our second episode on Light Horse Harry Lee. This chronicle explores the tragic, heroic life of Anne Hill Carter Lee. We trace her journey from the pampered parlors of Shirley to the drafty, chained chambers of the Northern Neck, Stratford Hall. We will examine the intense bond she forged with her youngest son, the modest brick townhouses of Alexandria, where a sickly mother and dutiful boy formed a domestic fortress against the disgrace of the outside world. And we'll observe the systemic, deliberate manner in which Anne cultivated in Robert everything that it would take to oppose the fatal vices of his father, instilling in him the virtues of thrift, self-restraint, Christian submission. And then we'll witness her passing, seeing how the young lieutenant served as her nurse, and trace how her quiet, steel-spined legacy continued to direct the commander who led the armies of the South. It's the story of sweetness and steel, the woman whose sacrifice built the legendary leader of Virginia. So, in the closing decades of the 18th century, Shirley Plantation, situated upon a broad, fertile bend of the James River in Charles City County, was one of the greatest of monuments to the power and wealth of the Virginia gentry that we covered in a past episode. The master of Shirley was Charles Carter, a grandson of the legendary Robert King Carter and undisputed patriarch of one of the richest families in North America. Charles Carter ruled over hundreds of enslaved laborers, thousands of acres of prime riverfront land, and an immense fortune in transatlantic shipping and securities. He was a man of hospitality and authority, fathering 23 children across 2 marriages and governing his plantation empire with an open hand and an iron eye for order. Among this sprawling brood of siblings and cousins, young Anne Hill Carter was born in the spring of 1773, and she occupied a place of singular affection. She was the beloved pet of her aging father, who doted upon her quiet, gentle nature and sheltered her from every rough wind of the colonial world. Nancy grew up within the stately 3-story brick mansion of Shirley, surrounded by carved walnut paneling, imported English silver, and portraits of ancestral grandees. She received the finest education then available to a Virginia lady of the first rank, and she was thoroughly instructed in the English classics. She mastered the French language. She became an accomplished musician at the harpsichord, and she was steeped from her infancy in the solemn liturgical rhythms of the Book of Common Prayer. And in the spring of 1793, the 20-year-old heiress was courted by the 37-year-old governor of Virginia, Henry Light Horse Harry Lee. Eventually, she was courted by him, that is, fresh from his triumphs in the Revolution and his election to the executive mansion in Richmond. Harry Lee was the most glamorous, celebrated man in the Commonwealth. Recently widowed by the tragic death of his first wife, Divine Matilda Lee of Stratford Hall, the governor was a frequent visitor to the drawing rooms of Shirley. But Harry's passionate attempts at courtship were not directed at Anne. They were, rather, directed at her beautiful first cousin, Maria Farley. Harry pursued Maria with a furious romantic intensity, sending impassioned letters, deploying all his legendary charm in an attempt to win her hand. It wasn't enough, and Anne Carter, watching from the shadows of the parlor, was consumed by her own desperate, secret love for the dashing governor. She idolized Harry Lee as the living embodiment of martial glory, chivalric virtue, everything a dashing gentleman should be. So profound was Anne's devotion to Harry's happiness, even at the expense of her own heart, that when Maria Farley confided her intention to reject the governor's suit for good, Anne could not contain her anguish. In a moment of unguarded agony, Anne seized her cousin's arm and cried out, "Oh, stop, stop, Maria. You do not know what you are throwing away." Maria remained unmoved, decisively delivering her rejection to the suitor. It was to be a good decision, but Harry Lee, wounded in his pride and desperate to secure a wealthy wife to stabilize his rapidly crumbling personal finances, turned to the adoring young woman who had watched him from afar. Finding in Anne Carter a ready, worshipful affection, Harry swiftly proposed marriage on the rebound. When news of the engagement reached the master of Shirley, Charles Carter was unhappy. As we covered in our second episode on Harry Lee, Carter harbored an absolute, unyielding skepticism regarding Harry, namely his financial stability and his character. And rightly so. Harry was rogue, but he was to marry Anne. And so Charles Carter, who had watched with alarm as Harry engaged in manic, speculative land schemes, borrowed money recklessly, racked up massive debts across the continent, opposed the marriage, doing so with all the force of his patriarchal authority, warning Anne that the dashing war hero was a spendthrift who would bring ruin upon her head and misery to her. But Anne was blinded with adoration. She pleaded with her father, insisting that Harry's nobility of character was absolute, and that her love could anchor his restless spirit. Reluctantly, Charles Carter yielded to his favorite daughter's tears. For those interested in a fuller discussion of it, we got into why he backed down during our second episode on the life of Light Horse Harry Lee. In any case, on June 18th, 1793, in the grand parlor of Shirley Plantation, Anne Hill Carter and Governor Henry Lee were united in holy matrimony. The wedding was celebrated with all the lavish bounty of the James River gentry. Tables groaned under roasted meats and fine Madeira wine. The elite of Virginia gathered to toast the brilliant union of two great dynasties that had long been feuding. But this dream quickly dissolved. Within just a short space of a fortnight, as was later said, the romantic illusion was shattered. In the wake of the marriage, the 20-year-old bride discovered that her husband did not love her with the devoted passion she'd envisioned. Harry was cold, restless, and unfaithful, viewing his young wife not really as an intellectual or emotional partner who could replace his first wife, the divine Matilda, but as an ornament and a convenient source of fresh capital. Margaret Sanborn, describing this aspect of her life and how it helped mold what she taught her young son Robert, notes, quote, although Anne Hill Carter knew when she married Harry Lee that he did not love her, she hoped ultimately to win his heart, or at least bind him to her with ties of affection. But in the short space of a fortnight, a relative of Maria Bird Farley confided to her sister, Anne found that her affections were trampled on by a heartless and depraved profligate. I am right as to time. One fortnight was her dream of happiness from which she awoke to a life of misery. Her fortune was soon thrown away upon his debts contracted previous to marriage. She was despised and neglected. And Harry, meanwhile, sought his pleasure elsewhere. His intrigues with other women were soon known to the Carters and probably became general knowledge. One of Anne's kinswomen, writing to the family at Shirley, delicately recounted the details of Harry's latest amour, adding tersely but significantly, poor Anne. Anne must have heard soon of these affairs and seen the futility of winning his love, but instead of escaping from her unhappy situation, as she might so easily have done, she chose to remain with Lee, thereby revealing a remarkable capacity for self-command, a trait that would be inherited by her fourth son, Robert Edward. She held the secret of her unhappiness as successfully as she had kept from Maria Farley her love for this man. With Shirley so close, her visits home were frequent. Here she basked in the devotion of her parents and her sisters and brothers, and could indulge her highly sociable Carter nature in the delights of the season at Williamsburg, the races, or festivities at neighboring plantations, temporarily submerging her unhappiness in these diversions. End quote. Her heartbreak deepened when Harry, after being thrown out of the governor's mansion in Richmond in the wake of his participation in the Whiskey Rebellion, removed his young bride from the warm, convivial society of Shirley and Richmond and transported her to Stratford Hall on the lower Potomac. Stratford was no longer the vibrant, golden seed of the colonial Lees. It had become an isolated, cold, and deteriorating pile of brick. The vast halls were drafty and neglected. The plaster was peeling. The agricultural lands were covered in weeds rather than cash crops. For Anne, the mansion, which she could use increasingly less of as the family had to constrain itself, felt less like a home than a haunted mausoleum dedicated to the memory of her predecessor, Matilda. Everywhere she looked, Anne was confronted by the mute, lingering tokens of the long-gone first wife of Light Horse Harry Lee, the woman who got to experience Stratford in its glory days, Matilda's shrouded harp standing silently in the corner, Matilda's portrait gazing down from the high walls, and trunks filled with Matilda's imported silk ball gowns resting in the bedchambers. In this damp, isolated fortress, Anne spent long months in near total seclusion, largely abandoned by a husband who spent his weeks riding across the countryside, pursuing new land deals, politicking in Richmond, or being unfaithful. Her health, always delicate, began to deteriorate under the chronic strain of domestic neglect and the damp, marshy climate of the decaying mansion. In a poignant, heartbreaking letter penned in 1799, the young mistress of Stratford summarized the profound, suffocating loneliness of her existence in rural Westmoreland County, which was quite isolated, quoting Alexander Pope to describe her daily reality. The world forgetting, by the world forgot. The pampered pet of Shirley had become a lonely prisoner of the Potomac, trapped in a loveless marriage to a man whose downward spiral was accelerating toward catastrophe. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the financial walls closed in upon Stratford. Light Horse Harry's speculative mania had reached a fever pitch, and he'd borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from friends, kinsmen, and financiers, sinking the capital into worthless Western tracts and bankrupt companies. By the early 1800s, the courts of Virginia were inundated with legal judgments, chancery suits, writs of execution against the former governor. The Lee family was living on borrowed time and borrowed bread. At Shirley, old Charles Carter watched with mounting distress, burning rage, and deep sorrow. Like Matilda once had, he realized that if he did not take drastic legal measures, Harry Lee would reduce Anne and her growing brood of children, Algernon, Carter, Smith, and young Anne, to absolute penury. In 1803, Charles Carter executed a codicil to his last will and testament, constructing what's remembered or called the Carter Shield. Carter bypassed his son-in-law, rather than bequeathing Anne her share of his vast estate and cash or land directly, which under Virginia law would automatically become the property of her husband. Carter placed her entire inheritance into a testamentary trust, the legacy consisting primarily of hundreds of valuable dividend-paying shares in the Bank of Virginia was placed under the control of independent trustees, Anne's brothers, Robert and Edward Carter. The terms of the trust were that the capital was to be held entirely separate from Henry Lee, protected forever from his debts, liens, and bankruptcies. The annual dividend income was to be paid directly into Anne's hands for her personal maintenance and the education of her children. This would be the sole barrier that prevented the family from tumbling into the abyss of pauperism. In the meantime, life was still terrible inside Stratford Hall. By the winter of 1806, the plantation was in a state of siege. Sheriffs, constables, process servers from Westmoreland, Richmond, and federal courts swarmed around the estate daily, brandishing warrants for Harry's arrest. To prevent the bailiffs from entering the house to serve writs or attach the remaining furniture, Harry ordered heavy iron chains and massive oak bars strung across the grand double doors of Stratford's Great Hall. The family lived in what amounted to a state of lockdown. Overseers and trusted servants guarded the entrances, shouting warnings whenever strangers appeared on the gravel road. Inside the mansion, the rooms grew progressively colder, darker, more cheerless, as piece after piece of furniture and silver plate was secretly carted away or seized whenever Harry ventured outside the doors. It was into this nightmare of financial ruin that Anne Hill Carter Lee discovered in the late spring of 1806 that she was once again pregnant. She was 33 years old, exhausted by respiratory illness, drained by her husband's erratic behavior, terrified for the future of her children. In the private, unguarded moments of her correspondence, Anne admitted that she didn't want this fifth child. To bring another life into a household shadowed by disgrace, locked behind chained doors, seemed to her to be an act of cruelty. So she carried the child through the sweltering summer and bleak autumn of 1806 with a despairing heart, praying for the strength to survive the coming trial. It was made all the worse by the fact that Anne made a journey to Shirley to visit her ailing father, hoping to find a brief respite among her family. But when she arrived, she found that her beloved father was dead, and the Lee family carriage was too broken down to take her back home to Stratford, and Harry had not another to send her, nor the means to procure one. Months later, in the winter, he finally sent an open-topped carriage in which she and the children returned to Stratford. Returning to Stratford in an open carriage during a bitter, freezing winter gale, Anne caught a severe cold. When she arrived at Stratford Hall, she was feverish, coughing violently, racked by physical pain. Within days, she went into early, difficult labor. The setting of the birth was an indictment of the family's fallen state. Stratford was freezing. Firewood was scarce. The estate was virtually abandoned. Only a single fireplace was kept burning in the entire mansion, the hearth in the drafty ground floor southeast bedchamber. There, on January 19th, 1807, amidst the howling winter winds, iron chains rattling against the front doors and the chill seeping through the brick walls, Anne gave birth to a son. She named him Robert Edward Lee, in a tribute of the deep and abiding love for the brothers who protected her through the Carter Trust. The child that Anne had candidly dreaded while in the room arrived like an angel of mercy in the nursery. Robert was remarkably healthy, robust, a beautiful infant, with large, dark brown eyes and an extraordinarily quiet, amiable disposition. Anne's maternal despair melted into a profound, fierce devotion. She looked upon this baby not just as an additional burden, but as a special gift from God, sent to comfort her in her hour of affliction. The sickly, heartbroken mother, the quiet winter baby formed an immediate bond, one forged in the shadow of defeat that would outlast the dynasty itself. As Hendrick puts it in the Lees of Virginia, quote, as not infrequently happens with unwanted children, Robert presently became his mother's inseparable companion and the chief comfort of her life. It is no wonder the child was so handsome and sweet-tempered. Some have held that Robert E. Lee was a Carter, not a Lee, and certainly in temperament, in character, in method, in sense of responsibility, in habit of mind, and taste, always accepting that supreme taste for military life. The Confederate leader bore little resemblance to Light Horse Harry. In mental tranquility and spaciousness of outlook, the man seemed more adapted to Shirley beside the James than to Stratford on the Potomac. The fact is that Robert Lee's association both with Stratford and with his father was slight. End quote. The final collapse of the household at Stratford Hall was not long delayed. In April of 1809, the sheriff of Westmoreland County finally trapped Light Horse Harry outside the chained doors, arresting him for a debt of over 5,400 Spanish silver dollars. The hero of the Revolution was hauled down the road to the county seat of Montrose and locked inside a tiny stone cell in the debtor's prison. For a year, Anne was left alone at Stratford with her young children, managing the crumbling plantation on her meager trust funds while her husband sat behind iron bars writing his military memoirs. When Harry was finally released in the spring of 1810 under the Insolvent Debtors Act, the end had arrived. His eldest son by his first marriage, Henry Lee IV, later be known as Black Horse Harry, as we covered in the last episode, turned 21 and asserted his ownership of Stratford Hall under Matilda's trust. Harry was evicted from the house. Anne, at this point, asserted her iron will. She'd endured 17 years of neglect, isolation, terror within the walls of Stratford. She refused to remain a dependent in the house of her stepson, nor would she permit her children to grow up in the ruins of the family's life in Westmoreland County. Gathering her family, her few remaining possessions, and her Carter trust papers, Anne turned her back on Stratford Hall forever, leading her children out of the wilderness into a new, independent course in the city of Alexandria. This relocation of the Lee family to Alexandria in 1811 marked the beginning of a new chapter in the life of Anne Lee. Alexandria was a bustling, prosperous seaport in the upper Potomac, a city of clean cobblestone streets, thriving shipping wharves, solid Georgian brick townhouses. More importantly, it was a major social center for the extended network of the Carter, Fitzhugh, and Washington families. Here, Anne was surrounded by respectable kinsmen who respected her virtue, protected her dignity, and offered a warm, supportive community for her children, whatever the faults of their ne'er-do-well father. Settling her family into a modest, rented brick townhouse on Cameron Street, and later moving to a comfortable residence on Orinoco Street, Anne created a quiet, disciplined domestic sanctuary. The lifestyle was frugal in the extreme. Deprived of landed wealth and living entirely upon the modest quarterly dividends of her Bank of Virginia stock, Anne managed her household with a scrupulous, exacting economy. There were no lavish dinner parties, no imported European luxuries, no blooded racehorses. Every penny was counted, every meal was carefully planned, every resource was husbanded to ensure that her children received the education and spiritual grounding lifestyle required of Virginia gentlefolk. They weren't starving or even necessarily poor, but they were on a tight budget and dependent upon the bank to issue solid, stable dividends, which didn't always happen. Yet the ghost of Light Horse Harry continued to cast its dark shadow over the household. In the summer of 1812, Harry traveled to Baltimore and became embroiled in the horrific riot at the Federal Republican newspaper offices, and he ended up beaten, slashed, tortured by a pro-war mob. He returned to Alexandria, a terrifying, broken wreck, his once handsome face disfigured, his speech slurred, his body in constant pain. The presence of the crippled, irritable general in the small rented house only deepened the domestic strain. Finally, in May of 1813, when Robert was just 6 years old, the father made his permanent, unceremonious exit. Unable to face his creditors, seeking a warmer climate to soothe his wounds, Light Horse Harry boarded a ship bound for the West Indies, escaping his debts and abandoning his family to their fate. He would wander through the Caribbean as a threadbare pauper for 5 long years, never returning to Virginia. Robert E. Lee would never look upon his father's face again. With Harry's departure, the responsibility for the household fell squarely upon Anne's frail shoulders, her being once again abandoned by the husband she once loved, but her own physical strength was rapidly giving way. She had developed chronic pulmonary tuberculosis, the dreaded consumption of the 19th century, and this left her weak, feverish, subject to coughing fits. Simultaneously, her older sons were scattered by the demands of life. Charles Carter Lee, the eldest, was sent north to Harvard University to study law, while Sidney Smith Lee, the second son, entered the United States Navy as a midshipman at the age of 15, spending long years at sea. We covered his life in some depth in our episode on the Lees of Leesylvania. In this quiet, semi-invalid household on Orinoco Street, young Robert Edward Lee stepped forward to become the center of his mother's world. Between the ages of 11 and 18, while other boys of his age and class were indulging in outdoor sports, youthful leisure, all of that, Robert, who did some of that to be sure, mainly assumed the full responsibilities of being both a family steward and a devoted daughter. He carried the family keys hooked to his belt, unlocking the pantries, managing the household stores. The market basket on his arm, the slender, handsome boy walked down the streets of Alexandria each morning, negotiating with local butchers and grocers, carefully comparing prices, recording every single expenditure in his mother's neat ledger books down to the fraction of a cent. Robert became his mother's primary nurse, companion, and protector. He mixed her daily herbal tinctures, measured out her medicines with precision. When the afternoon sun broke through the Virginia clouds, Robert would walk into Anne's sick room, gently lift his frail, lightweight mother in his strong young arms, carry her down the staircase to her carriage. He would arrange her shawls and pillows, propping her up to ensure she caught no draft, then take the reins himself, driving her slowly through the countryside to give her the fresh air the physicians prescribed. During these long, quiet carriage rides through the rolling hills of Fairfax County, an extraordinarily deep communion formed between the invalid mother and her dutiful son. They spoke of classical duty, family honor, the sovereign goodness of God, the necessity of maintaining an unblemished name, of the name of Lee. Robert anticipated her every need with a quiet, instinctive tenderness. If her breathing grew labored, he would adjust her cushions. If the wind turned cold, he would turn the carriage toward home. When the journey was done, he'd carry her up the steps. The depth of this attachment was laid bare in the spring of 1825 when Robert won his appointment to the military academy at West Point. Anne was proud of her son, particularly as this appointment would provide a poor gentleman's son with an honorable, independent career that required no reliance on family wealth, of which he had almost none, thanks to his rascal of a father and disgrace of a half-brother. Yet the prospect of his departure dealt a crushing blow to her fragile heart. As his trunks were packed and the hour of separation approached, Anne broke down in tears, crying out, "How can I live without Robert? He is both son and daughter to me." She had leaned upon him for a decade, finding in his quiet competence the only stable anchor in a world of domestic storms. In letting him go, Anne was surrendering the greatest comfort of her earthly existence. As Douglas Southall Freeman, describing her passing somewhat later on in his Robert E. Lee notes, quote, "Anne Carter Lee was 56 when she died. She had been a mother for 31 years and a widow for 11. Nearly all her married life of 2 decades and a half had been clouded with financial worry. For at least 17 years before her death, she'd carried the burden of maintaining the family on her personal income. Of all that she thought and planned and suffered during those years, hardly an echo has survived in the indifferent roar of a hurrying century. The scant score of letters in her autograph that now remain, and the few references to her and the extant correspondence of her kinspeople and friends do not suffice to give more than the most shadowy outlines of personality. She had patience in misfortune. She used wisely the little that she possessed. She served a God who was very real to her. She kept her friends and she loved her kin. She had the wisdom and skill with which to vitalize for her children the virtue of self-control. She made their interests her own. She must have had much of the Carter interest in life and some of the Carter sense of humor. She had high, uncomplaining courage in facing continued adversity. This much is known. But in what manner she dealt with a spendthrift husband 17 years her senior, and what she thought of the life she had left at Shirley or the life she had led among the Lees, How she went about the rearing of Robert, whether she believed he would become a great man, she does not tell us. None of her letters to Robert is known to be in existence, and only 2 of those to Smith are left. End quote. The relationship between Anne Carter Lee and her famous son was not just one of mutual comfort. It was deliberate, rigorous, highly successful as a pedagogical campaign. Anne was a woman of formidable intellect and deep moral clarity. She lived through the grim destruction of a great dynasty, watching with horror as Light Horse Harry's cycle of promise, overconfidence, recklessness, disaster, and ruin had dragged her families through debtor's prison and public disgrace. She was fiercely determined, while living, that this fatal cycle would never, under any circumstances, be repeated in her children. Through her daily instruction, her letters, her personal example, Anne systematically inoculated Robert with what can only be described as the anti-Harry precepts, the complete counter to his father's character. The first, most urgent of these lessons was an unyielding horror of personal debt and a devotion to extreme thrift. Having lived through the terror of bailiffs and the humiliation of seeing her dowry vanish into speculative land deals, Anne taught Robert that debt was not just a financial inconvenience, but a mortal sin against gentlemanly honor and Christian liberty. To be in debt was to be in a state of dependency, to surrender one's self-command to the arbitrary will of another. She trained Robert to live scrupulously within his meager means, to abhor credit, and to keep exact, meticulous accounts of every penny that passed through his hands, and always to save something. Robert absorbed this lesson into his very marrow. Throughout his long life as an army engineer, plantation manager, a general, he never bought a single item for which he could not pay cash, and he tracked his expenditures down to the single cent in a small, leather-bound notebook. He was also a scrupulous and very successful investor, adeptly buying everything from state bonds to bank shares and building up a small fortune of his own before the war between the states began. The second pillar was the gospel of self-control and self-denial. Light Horse Harry had been destroyed by his passions, his vanity, his rages, his thin-skinned pride, his insatiable hunger for public applause and great riches. He could never see a thing through, nor deny himself that which he wanted. Anne, fortunately for her children, fortunately for Robert, was quite the opposite. She taught Robert that the true aristocrat mastered his own heart. She drilled him in the virtues of modesty, emotional restraint, punctuality, self-sacrifice. A gentleman did not boast, did not display temper, never placed his own desires above the needs of his dependents. She taught him to view duty as the absolute, non-negotiable compass of human existence, a severe, beautiful standard of conduct that required the complete subordination of personal ambition to the service of what one ought do, which typically meant to serve others. Finally, Anne grounded Robert in a deep, sincere, uncompromising evangelical faith. In an era where many of the Virginia gentry were practicing something of a cool, detached, and formal deism, Anne was a woman of real, intense, personal Christian piety. And so she grounded Robert in the doctrines of the Episcopal Church, drilling him in the catechism, teaching him the Book of Common Prayer, leading him daily through the pages of the Bible. And she taught him the supreme virtue of Christian submission, the belief that all earthly trials, illnesses, and disappointments were part of the mysterious, sovereign providence of a loving God. So she taught him to accept suffering without bitterness, to face adversity with calm, dignified fortitude, and to place his trust not in the fickle honors of this world, but the eternal mercy of Christ. One can see in that much that later influenced Robert's life. William Jackson Johnstone, describing this impact on her son's religious life and his, Robert E. Lee the Christian, says, quote, "Such a character as Robert E. Lee does not happen. It is the product of generations of Christian ancestry. It is not an individual accomplishment. It is a family development." End quote. Johnstone then notes, quote, "No picture of Robert E. Lee could be complete that did not portray the religious side of his character. It was the basis upon which all else rested. It was the source of his strength, the law of his life, the guide for his every act, and the support upon which he leaned in every trial." End quote. It was his mother that gave him that. It was armed with these lessons that Robert went to West Point, and in June 1829 graduated second in his class, achieving a feat that remains almost unique in the long history of the military academy. During his entire 4 years at West Point, through thousands of rigorous inspections, parades, drills, he didn't receive a single demerit. And then, when he graduated, Anne's tuberculosis had reached its terminal stage. Too weak to remain in Alexandria, she had been moved to Ravensworth, the grand country estate of her wealthy kinsman, William Henry Fitzhugh, long a man who had aided her and her family, such as by giving them the use of a nice town home in which they could reside in Alexandria. So, when he graduated, Lee rode at top speed to Ravensworth, throwing off his uniform to take his place at the bedside of his dying mother. For the next 4 weeks, the newly graduated officer became Anne's full-time, round-the-clock nurse. He refused to delegate her care to servants or nurses. As Douglas Southall Freeman describes it in his R.E. Lee, the summer after his graduation should have been for Robert the happiest of all these seasons of carefree visiting, but it was, instead, one of the saddest periods of his life. The joy of homecoming was ruined by the illness of his mother. Her health had been bad during the winter, though there had been some signs of improvement with the spring. When Robert arrived, she was at Ravensworth, in a worse condition than ever, and was ready to die. Charles Carter was developing his practice. Smith was progressing in the Navy. Anne, in 1826, had married William Lewis Marshall, a minister who later became an attorney of station. Mildred, in her 19th year, was in friendly hands. Now Robert was embarking on a career of high promise. Anne Carter Lee had seen it through, but the struggle had cost her all her vitality. She could fight for nothing further. Robert immediately resumed his old duties as a nurse. He mixed her medicines, administered them, and watched her bed almost continuously. When he left her room, her gaze followed him, and she would look steadily at the door until he entered again. It was not a long siege this time. He sat by her bedside in the sweltering July heat, wiping the cold sweat from her fevered brow, lifting her emaciated body to turn her pillows, administering her drops of laudanum, and holding her frail, trembling hands through the long, agonizing nights of respiratory distress. Witnesses who visited the sick room left behind deeply moving accounts of the communion between the dying mother and her soldier son. It was recorded that Anne was too weak to speak for hours, but her dark, expressive eyes followed Robert with an intense, radiant devotion whenever he moved across the room. She was content and calm only when she felt his strong, gentle hand resting in hers. On July 26, 1829, surrounded by her children within the quiet bedchamber at Ravensworth, Anne breathed her last. She was 56 years old. Her long, silent martyrdom had ended. The gentle heiress of Shirley, who had endured 36 years of heartbreak, debt, and physical suffering with unbending Christian fortitude, entered into her eternal rest. Having no landed estate of her own, she bequeathed the remaining principal of her protected Carter trust funds directly to her daughters, so they would never face the financial vulnerability that had trapped her youth. To her sons, she left a tract of uncultivated mountain land in Patrick County and 30 slaves. Robert's personal share of her liquid estate amounted to about $3,000, a pittance compared to the baronial fortunes of his ancestors. Robert E. Lee stood at the threshold of manhood as the first generation of his family since the days of Richard I, whose life we covered before, who possessed no great plantation, no vast rent rolls, no ancestral mansion. He would have to survive, support a family, and carve out his destiny entirely on what he could earn by his own labor as a junior engineer in the United States Army, or what he could marry into. But he possessed an inheritance far more important to him and who he became than land or gold. He carried within his soul the character bestowed upon him by his mother. In Lee's life, as we'll cover in the episodes soon to come, one can see the living, enduring monument of Anne Hill Carter Lee. Every defining hallmark of Robert E. Lee's public and private life stemmed from what he learned from his mother's knee in Alexandria. His lifelong devotion to invalid women, spending decades patiently nursing his crippled, arthritic wife, Mary Custis Lee, caring for his delicate daughters, was the reflex of a boy who'd carried the family keys and mixed the medicines for his consumptive mother. His absolute punctuality, his legendary self-denial, his refusal to touch alcohol or engage in public boasting, his meticulous financial ledgers that balanced the penny, his profound, reflexive submission to the degrees of prominence were all the direct fruit of what his mother had taught him. She had taken the volatile, high-strung blood of the Lees, filtered it through the gentle, enduring steel of the always competent Carters, and constructed the man capable of commanding both an army and his self. As Douglas Southall Freeman puts it in Robert E. Lee, Biography, Volume 4, quote, Light Horse Harry Lee passed on to his youngest son his fine physique, his aptitude for military affairs, his great intelligence, his daring, his sense of public duty, and the charm of manner that made him so readily a captain. The characteristics of his mother that reappear were her religion, her thrift, her self-control, her social sense, and her patience in adversity. End quote. Similarly, Emery Thomas, describing what she had accomplished in his book Robert E. Lee, notes, quote, Anne Lee had made the best of an unfortunate marriage and raised her children in circumstances usually comfortable, if hardly splendid, or always secure. She had managed to educate them and expose them to life among the Virginia gentry. Never wealthy, she still had black slaves to serve her, and she usually traveled in her own carriage behind her own horses. Her children possessed little in the way of monetary legacy, but they had family name, social connections, and proper training for successful lives. End quote. The profound, indelible nature of the maternal imprint put upon Lee was revealed in a deeply moving scene that played out 40 years after Anne's death. In the spring of 1870, just a few months before his own passing, an aging, white-haired Robert E. Lee, broken in health, exhausted by war, serving as the president of Washington College, made a final journey through northern Virginia, which he had once called home. He stopped to spend the night at Ravensworth, the Fitzhugh estate where his mother had died. Accompanied by a young kinsman, General Lee walked slowly up the broad staircase and stepped into the second-floor bedchamber. The room had remained largely unchanged across 4 decades. The old general walked over to the old bed, took off his hat, and stood for a long, silent hour, staring down at the mattress where Anne Hill Carter Lee had drawn her last breath. Tears welled up in the eyes of the great soldier. He turned slowly to his companion, his voice trembling with deep emotion, and he whispered, 40 years ago, I stood in this room by my mother's deathbed. It seems now but yesterday. The intervening decades, the battlefields, the roar of cannon, the loss of his country, the burden of military command had faded away. In that quiet room, the General-in-Chief of the Confederacy, the President of Washington College, was once again the dutiful young lieutenant holding the hand of the woman who had made him. The great soldier who captured the imagination of the American continent was not the reincarnation of the swashbuckling, reckless Light Horse Harry Lee. He was the quiet, enduring, magnificent masterpiece of Anne Hill Carter Lee's long and silent sacrifice. Through the sweetness of her love and the unbreakable steel of her character, she had taken a family broken by shame and forged a man whose honor would endure forever. Thanks for listening. In the next few episodes, I'll be covering the life of Robert E. Lee in more detail, in great detail. Please remember to like this show, subscribe to this channel, share this episode around if you enjoyed it, as that's how we grow and how you can keep this going. I hope you did enjoy this one. It came at listener request, so I hope you liked it. Bye.